The San Diego air drifted through the kitchen window that Saturday morning, carrying the scent of salt from the Pacific and the sweet perfume of the roses that Ricardo, my late husband, had planted for me over 40 years ago. It was our ritual. On the anniversary of his passing, I always woke before the sun, brewed a strong black coffee exactly as he liked it, and went down to the garage. It was there that the most vivid part of him still breathed, encapsulated in cherry red metal and white leather. The 1966 Ford Mustang was not just a car. It was the materialization of a promise, the silent witness to our entire life together. I remember the day he brought it home, the engine rumbling like a contented animal. "For my Elena," he said with that smile that could disarm any worry, "so that you never forget how free we are when we are together." And I never forgot. In that car, we brought our newborn children home from the hospital, traveled down the coast on lazy summer afternoons, mourned the loss of our parents, and celebrated every small victory life offered us. The garage was my sanctuary. The smell of oil, gasoline, and dust mingled with the memory of his scent, creating an atmosphere that soothed my soul. Every tool on the workbench was exactly where he left it. The grease stain on the cement floor told a story. Holding the cold car key in the palm of my hand, I felt the weight of all those memories. But that morning, something was different. A strange, heavy silence hung over the house. As I turned the doorknob of the door that connected the kitchen to the garage, my heart lurched. The door creaked open, and what I found was a vacuum, an empty, aseptic space where the soul of our family used to rest. Ricardo's scent was gone, replaced by a devastating silence, cold as a tombstone. My eyes swept the space, searching, denying, until they landed on a piece of folded white paper on the tool bench. The hurried, presumptuous handwriting of my children, David and Sophia, jumped out at me. "Mom," the note began, "we made a great deal and sold the old car. The money will help you with expenses. We know you've been tight. It was for your own good. We'll call later. With love, David and Sophia." The words danced before my eyes, each one a precise stab to the center of my chest. Old car. Great deal. For your own good. The condescension, the coldness, the total erasure of everything that Mustang represented. They hadn't sold a car. They had stolen my identity, auctioned off their father's memory for a few crumbs of convenience. My legs gave way, and I had to lean against the cold wall. The grief I felt was immediate and brutal, but beneath it, something else began to bubble up. A cold, lucid, and sharp fury. They saw me as a burden, a sentimental old woman attached to a useless relic, and in that deafening silence of the empty garage, where Ricardo's legacy had been replaced by the betrayal of our own children, I did not cry. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs, and the history teacher I had been for 30 years awoke. They had underestimated the woman who taught about empires that fall through arrogance and about revolutions born from silence. They had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. We would like to feel your presence at this very moment. Please, write in the comments what city you are watching us from and what time it is there now. I want to know how far my voice reaches. Still standing in the cold garage. My children's note trembled in my hand, the thin paper feeling as fragile and yet as heavy as a gravestone. The echo of the empty space was a silent scream that resonated within me. Outside, the California sun was beginning to warm the asphalt, and I could hear the distant sound of a lawnmower, the bark of a dog, the banal noises of a world that continued to turn, indifferent to the implosion of my own existence. Every detail of that space now assaulted me. The oil stain where the Mustang's engine used to rest was an open wound in the cement. The hook on the wall, where the spare key used to hang, a skeletal finger pointing at nothing. My fingers, trembling and cold, dialed David's number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. I could picture him perfectly, in his law office overlooking the bay, wearing an expensive suit, the phone vibrating on the polished mahogany desk. He was the personification of the success Ricardo and I had always dreamed of for our children. But somewhere along the way, ambition had corroded his soul. replacing compassion with a kind of brutal efficiency. "Mom?" he answered, his voice laden with impatience, the sound of papers being shuffled in the background. I tried to speak, but my voice was a thread, a whisper that could barely escape my throat. "David, the car," I managed to say. There was a pause, followed by a long, condescending sigh, a sound I knew all too well. It was the sound he made when I took too long to understand an app on my phone or when I repeated a story. "Mom, I don't have time for this right now," he said, his voice sharp. "We already explained in the note. It was an excellent deal. The money has already been transferred to your account. Think of it as a help, a way to ensure you don't face hardship. You need to be practical. It was just a pile of old metal gathering dust and expenses." Every word was spoken with a cold logic, calculated to make me feel foolish, irrational, a sentimental child. He wasn't listening to me. He was managing me, as if I were a problematic asset in his portfolio. "But it was your father's," I insisted, my voice cracking. "Dad would have agreed," he retorted too quickly, a rehearsed defense. He was a practical man. He would want you to be secure and not attached to things. "Mom, I have an important meeting. We'll talk over the weekend. Use the money for something useful." And with that, the call ended. The silence that followed was more violent than any scream. He had not only justified the theft, he had desecrated the memory of his own father to do it. I stood there, the dead phone in my hand, feeling the crushing weight of being a burden, an inconvenient relic in my own son's perfectly planned life. Hanging up with David was like having a door slammed in my face. My next call to Sophia was like consciously walking into an abyss, foolishly hoping to find a soft landing. I clung to a last spark of hope, the memory of my daughter as a sweet girl who made daisy chains in the garden. That girl, however, had long been buried under layers of Botox, designer clothes, and a desperate need for social validation. When she answered, the sound of ambient music and lively chatter leaked through the line. "Mom, what a surprise," she said, her voice affectedly cheerful. "I'm here at the spa with the girls. Detox day. You should come one of these days. It would do you a world of good." The frivolity in her voice was so dissonant with my pain that it made me physically nauseous. I forced the words out. "Sophia, the Mustang. What did you do?" Her sigh was different from David's. It was more dramatic, theatrical, the sigh of someone whose perfect afternoon had been interrupted by an inconvenience. "Oh, Mom, please, let's not ruin the day with this," she whined. "We did what was best for you. That car was dangerous old, and you barely ever took it out. Think of all the money we'll save on insurance and maintenance." She spoke as if she were granting me a huge favor, as if her greed were, in fact, an act of filial generosity. It was then that she delivered the final blow, with a casualness that shattered what was left of my heart. And the best part is, it stayed in the family. We sold it to Aunt Carmen. She always adored it, you know. She'll take super good care of it. She was so happy, Mom. You should have seen it. The double betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut. My own sister, the woman who grew up in my shadow, always coveting what was mine. Suddenly, I heard Sophia's voice move away from the phone. "Guys, hold on a second. It's my mom, being super sentimental about an old car we sold. Poor thing, she gets attached to everything." I heard muffled giggles on the other end. She had put me on speakerphone. I was, at that moment, the entertainment for her rich, bored friends. An anecdote. The dramatic old lady. The humiliation burned my face, hotter than any tear. I was no longer a mother being disrespected. I was a circus act. I hung up the phone without another word, my hand shaking so much that the device slipped and fell to the floor with a dull thud, the sound of my last illusion shattering. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of torpor, wandering through the house like a ghost. Every object seemed to accuse me. The picture frames with David and Sophia's fake smiles, the walls that once echoed with their childhood laughter. I sat on the front porch, on the old wooden swing that Ricardo built. The neighborhood was in full Saturday swing. Children rode their bikes, couples walked their dogs, and across the street, My neighbor, Mrs. Gable, was greeting guests for what looked like a small garden party. I watched the scene with a surreal detachment, as if watching a movie about a life that was no longer mine. That's when I heard it. A familiar rumble, deep and guttural, that made every hair on my body stand on end. For a delirious second, I thought I was imagining it, that my pain was conjuring ghosts. But the sound grew louder, closer, and then it appeared at the end of the street. The cherry-red Mustang, gleaming under the afternoon sun, as beautiful and majestic as I remembered. My heart leaped with wild hope. Had it all been a nightmare? Had they regretted it? But then I saw who was behind the wheel. My sister, Carmen. She wore enormous sunglasses, a silk scarf fluttering in her hair, and a smug look of triumph on her face. She drove slowly, savoring the moment, ensuring everyone on the street saw her. And she didn't stop at my house. She crossed the street and parked in front of Mrs. Gable's house, right in the middle of the party. The conversation stopped. Everyone turned to look. Carmen got out of the car like a movie star, running her hand over the gleaming bodywork. "Isn't she a beauty?" I heard her say loudly to the guests. "I bought her from my sister, Elena. She had no use for it anymore, poor thing. I decided to give this gem a good home." She looked directly at my porch, at me, and gave me a small wave, a gesture laden with a lifetime of envy finally sated. The neighbors looked from Carmen to me, their faces a mixture of curiosity, embarrassment, and pity. I was paralyzed on the swing, exposed, humiliated in front of everyone. My most private pain had become a public spectacle, a neighborhood gossip served with canapes and lemonade. My sanctuary, the memory of my love, was now my sister's victory trophy. I retreated. Inside, closing the door on the pitying glances and the sound of Carmen's victorious laughter. The silence of my house, once peaceful, was now oppressive, an accomplice to my loneliness. I walked to Ricardo's small office, a room I kept exactly as he had left it. Dust danced in the beams of light coming through the blinds, and the smell of old books and machine oil still hung in the air. My children and my sister saw the car as an object, a monetary value, a status symbol. They didn't understand. That, for Ricardo, that Mustang was more than that. It was a work of art, the pinnacle of his passion and his quiet genius. He would spend hours in the garage, not just fixing, but improving, studying, modifying. He talked to that engine as if it were a living creature. "They don't understand you, Elena," he would tell me, wiping the grease from his hands. "They see what's on the surface, but we know what's under the hood, don't we?" The memory of his voice, of his calm wisdom, acted as a balm and, at the same time, a catalyst. The sadness that had paralyzed me began to transform into something different, a cold, sharp clarity. They had judged me as weak, senile, a sentimental old woman they could manipulate. They had stripped me of my joy, my history, and paraded me as a fool for the world to see. The unconditional mother's love that had for so long blinded me to their greed finally shattered. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. I went to Ricardo's imposing oak desk, my fingers sliding over the worn wood. My children were smart. David was a lawyer, Sophia, a master of social manipulation. They had surely made sure the sale was legal on paper, but they were arrogant, and their arrogance had made them careless. They had forgotten a crucial detail about their father, a detail I had kept as a sacred secret. With a determination I hadn't felt in years, I took a small bunch of keys from the drawer and opened the bottom right compartment, one that had always been locked. Inside, untouched, was a single thick leather envelope, heavy with the weight of documents and the truth. They had stolen the car, but they forgot one thing. Ricardo was never just a mechanic, and inside that envelope lay the secret that would turn their greed into their own ruin. With the heavy leather envelope on Ricardo's desk, the present seemed to dissolve, and the walls of the office became a screen where the past projected itself with painful clarity. I remembered, when we were young, before bitterness and greed poisoned everything. I was a newly graduated history teacher, full of passion for tales of kings and revolutions, and Ricardo was a young mechanic with grease under his nails and stars in his eyes. He didn't see engines as machines. He saw them as hearts of steel, each with its own rhythm, its own soul. Our love was built amidst the smell of gasoline and chalk dust, in a small house in a neighborhood where dreams were more valuable than money. The Mustang was not born of extravagance, but of a pact. For 2 years, we saved every penny. I took extra classes in summer school, and Ricardo worked late, his body tired but his spirit tireless. When he finally brought the car home, that cherry red shining like a promise, it wasn't a symbol of status, but of partnership. It was our freedom on 4 wheels. When David was born, with his fragile lungs and persistent asthma, I didn't hesitate. An opportunity to get my master's degree, to perhaps become a museum curator, was set aside without a hint of regret. My universe was reduced to the rhythm of my son's breathing, to sleepless nights, to the smell of eucalyptus from the vaporizer. Ricardo, seeing my sacrifice, redoubled his efforts, turning the garage into his laboratory, always tinkering with the Mustang's engine, saying he was investing in our future. Years later, when Sophia arrived, a little storm of curls and smiles, our family seemed complete. A small, perfect ecosystem of love and mutual support, witnessed by the silent red giant in our garage. They were not children born with a silver spoon. They were children born of a love measured in time, in sacrifice, in hands held during midnight fevers, and in celebrations with pizza in the living room. I gave them my nights, my career, my body, and my soul. And I did it with the joy of a mother who saw in her children her greatest and most beautiful legacy. I did not know, at that time, that I was building a castle of love on the quicksand of ingratitude. The first crack in our family foundation was not an earthquake, but a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor. It happened when David was in college. He, who had been a boy grateful for the air he breathed, began to become a stranger, a young man who measured the value of the world and of people in figures and status. The change crystallized on an autumn evening when he brought home his first serious girlfriend, a pale blonde girl named Kimberly, whose family owned half of a neighboring county. For a whole week, I dedicated myself to preparing the perfect dinner. I cleaned the house until it shone, used the tablecloth I saved for special occasions, and cooked the dishes that were the heart of our heritage: mole poblano, tamales, arroz rojo. I wanted that girl to see the richness of our culture, the love I put into every grain of cumin. The evening started well, with forced smiles and trivial conversations. But when I served the main course, the rich, complex smell of the mole filling the room, David laughed. A short, humorless laugh. "Mom, you didn't have to make something so ethnic," he said, looking at Kimberly as if sharing an inside joke. "My mom is a little too traditional." I felt the blood drain from my face. The word ethnic sounded like an insult, as if my identity were something to be hidden. A shame. For the rest of the dinner, he continued to diminish me with small blows. He interrupted my stories about his grandmother, disdained his father's work as manual labor, and rushed through dessert, eager to take Kimberly to a more sophisticated place. That night, at my own dinner table, in front of a stranger, my son turned me into a caricature, a folkloric relic of a past he was desperate to escape. Ricardo said nothing, but after they left, he took my hand. His dark eyes filled with a disappointment that mirrored my own. It was the first time I felt humiliated by one of my children, the first time I realized that the love I had given unconditionally might one day not be enough to guarantee their respect. With Sophia, the cruelty was slower to manifest, but when it did, it was with the precision of a scalpel. While David was ashamed of our simplicity, Sophia learned to despise it. After she married a real estate investor and moved to a mansion in La Jolla, her visits became rare, as if the trip to our modest neighborhood were an expedition to a third-world country. The distance between us became an abyss after Ricardo's death. I was drowning in grief, and she offered me practical solutions: like selling the house and moving into a luxury retirement community where I wouldn't be any trouble. The deepest humiliation came a few years later. Sophia was throwing a large charity party at her house, an event that would be featured in the local social columns. She insisted I come. Naively, I thought it was a gesture of inclusion, of affection. I wore my best dress, did my hair, and arrived, feeling a nervousness that wasn't my own. The reality, however, was brutal. I was not a guest. I was an accessory, proof that she was a good daughter. She greeted me at the door with a kiss in the air and immediately led me to an isolated corner of the garden. "Mom, stay here, okay? Have some champagne. I don't want you to tire the guests with your sad stories about Dad, all right? It's a happy night." I sat on a hard chair for almost an hour, watching her float among her rich and powerful friends, laughing and shining, while I felt invisible. It was then, pretending to look for the restroom, that I passed by a group of women with whom she was chatting animatedly. I heard my daughter, my little girl, say in an affected voice, "It's a sacrifice, you know. I have to bring her, otherwise people think I'm a horrible daughter. But honestly, she's a weight, an extra mouth to worry about, and she refuses to be practical and sell that crumbling house." A weight, an extra mouth. At that moment, under the glow of crystal chandeliers and the sound of fake laughter, I was no longer a mother. I was an item on my daughter's list of obligations, a burden to be tolerated in exchange for a flawless public image. I returned to my corner, picked up my purse, and left through the back door, without anyone noticing my departure. And then there was Carmen, my younger sister, the shadow that followed me my whole life. Our childhood was a silent competition that only she seemed to be playing. I was the one who got the highest grades, the one the boys asked to dance, the one who married Ricardo, a man who not only loved her, but adored her. Carmen's marriage, in contrast, was to a bitter man who left her after 5 years, leaving her with more debt than memories. She never forgave me for my happiness. Her envy was a slow-acting poison, administered in small doses over decades. There were the compliments with a built-in criticism. "Your garden is lovely, Elena. You must have so much free time." There were the false concerns. "Don't you think a car as old and powerful as the Mustang is dangerous for a woman your age?" After Ricardo died, her envy found fertile ground in my grief. Her visits became more frequent, and she would inspect my house with the eyes of a predator. She coveted everything that represented the life she thought she deserved. My furniture, the jewelry Ricardo gave me, and above all, the Mustang. To her, the car was not a symbol of my love for Ricardo. It was the ultimate prize, the tangible proof of a better life that had been stolen from her. She would circle the car in the garage, running her fingers over the paint, her gaze a mixture of desire and resentment. "You should sell it, Elena," she would say, her voice syrupy. "It's too much for you to take care of. Let someone else enjoy it. Someone who would actually use it." I saw what she was doing, but I was too tired from grief to fight. I never imagined, not in my worst nightmares, that she would ally herself with my own children to rip it away from me. Their alliance was not forged in love for me, but in shared disdain. My children saw me as a financial and emotional burden. Carmen saw me as the guardian of a treasure she believed was hers by right. Together they found the perfect excuse to justify their cruelty, disguising greed and envy as concern for my well-being. They were 3 vultures circling what they believed to be a weak and dying prey. Back in the present, the weight of the leather envelope in my hands seemed to anchor me, pulling me out of the swamp of painful memories. The dust in Ricardo's office danced in the light, and I felt his presence there with me, calm and strong as he always was. I opened the metal clasp of the envelope. The smell of old paper and printer's ink filled the air. Inside, there was not just the car's title, as I had expected. There was much more. A series of documents, hand-drawn engine blueprints with an engineer's precision, correspondence with postmarks from Detroit and Germany, and photographs. Photos of a younger Ricardo, in overalls, next to men in suits and ties, all of them smiling, with the Mustang in the background, but a slightly different Mustang, with details that only a keen eye would notice. One of the letters, on Ford Motor Company letterhead, dated 1965, spoke of an experimental V8 engine prototype and thanked Ricardo for his discretion and genius in its assembly and secret testing. There was also an official appraisal, done by a company specializing in classic cars, which Ricardo had commissioned a few years before he died, a document he never showed me. My eyes scanned the numbers, and my breath caught in my throat. That yellowed paper contained a truth that transformed my children's betrayal from an act of cruelty into an act of monumental stupidity. My fingers traced Ricardo's signature on one of the documents, and a cold, powerful calm settled in my heart. The history teacher in me recognized the pattern. Arrogance always leads to a fall. My children and my sister thought they were selling a car for $20,000. But in that envelope, I held the proof that they had not only stolen their father's memory, they had thrown away a legacy worth a fortune, and I was about to teach them the true meaning of the word value. The weekend that followed my discovery was the longest, and paradoxically, the most lucid of my life. The grief that had enveloped me like a thick fog for years finally dissipated, replaced by a cutting clarity, a cold and unshakable purpose. I shed no more tears. The pain had crystallized into determination. I spent Saturday and Sunday locked in Ricardo's office, not as a grieving widow, but as a general preparing for battle. I spread the documents from the leather envelope across the large oak desk, the same desk where Ricardo had spent countless nights drawing his dreams. I read and reread every word, every clause, every footnote. The history teacher in me, trained to find patterns and truths in ancient texts, devoured those pages. I wasn't just reading about a car. I was deciphering my husband's last act of love and protection. He knew somehow that greed might one day try to erase his legacy, and he had left behind a map, a fortress of paper and ink. On Sunday afternoon, with a calm that surprised even myself, I made the first call. To Dr. Arthur Vance, the lawyer whose name was on the trust documents. He was an old army buddy of Ricardo's, a man I hadn't seen in nearly 30 years. His voice on the phone was that of an elderly man, but his mind was sharp as a razor. When I identified myself, there was a moment of silence, followed by a warm, "Elena." I thought I'd never hear that voice again. I told him the story, without emotion, laying out the facts as I had learned them. The sale, the betrayal, the documents. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, the silence on the other end of the line was heavy. "That Ricardo," he finally said with a low, admiring laugh. "He was always 3 steps ahead. Elena, they didn't just make a mistake. They committed an illegal act of monumental proportions. Rest assured, we will sort this out." After hanging up, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I was no longer alone. On Monday morning, I called my children and my sister. My voice was neutral, controlled. "I would like to have a family talk. Tonight, at my house. There are some details about the car sale we need to finalize." They agreed, their voices filled with that same condescension, not realizing the trap that was being set. I spent the rest of the day preparing, not with anger, but with a ritualistic precision. I baked the oatmeal cookies they loved as children. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee. The house was immaculate. I was setting the stage, and the smell of cinnamon and coffee was the perfect disguise for the scent of gunpowder that hung in the air. They arrived promptly at 7, together, like a small pack of predators sure of their position at the top of the food chain. David, with his leather briefcase and his important lawyer air, entered first, already looking at his watch. Sophia followed, floating in on a cloud of expensive perfume, her face a mask of rehearsed concern. And finally, Carmen, wearing a leather jacket that was a cheap imitation of the Mustang's seats, a smirk of superiority plastered on her lips. They sat on the living room sofa, the same sofa where years ago I read them stories before bed. The irony was so thick I could almost touch it. They believed this was another intervention, another attempt to deal with the sentimental old lady. Their exchanged glances said it all. Let's get this over with. I served coffee in my best porcelain cups and offered them cookies on a plate. Sophia took one, nibbled the edge, and commented, "Mom, you need to get rid of these cups. They're so old-fashioned." David, impatient, cleared his throat. "Mom, we appreciate the coffee, but I have a business dinner. What was so urgent?" Carmen remained silent, just watching, her eyes gleaming with a barely concealed triumph. I let the silence stretch for a moment, observing them. I saw the greed in David's eyes, the vanity in Sophia's, the envy on Carmen's face, and I felt nothing but a cold pity. They were prisoners of their own weaknesses, so blinded by them that they couldn't see the woman sitting in front of them. I was no longer the mother. They could silence with a sigh or intimidate with complicated words. I was the guardian of a secret, the executor of a plan laid out long before that night. And they, in their arrogance, had walked into my house unarmed, thinking the power still belonged to them. "I called you here," I began, my voice calm and level, the tone of a teacher addressing an unruly class, "because you proceeded with the sale of an asset that was very important to me and to your father, and I would like to understand the reasoning behind it." David snorted. "Mom, we've been over this. It was a practical decision. The car was just sitting there, depreciating." "Depreciating?" I interrupted, an eyebrow arched. It was the first time I had broken my passive role, and the surprise on their faces was visible. I ignored their reaction and continued, my gaze fixed on a point in the middle of the room, as if I were reciting a long-memorized lesson. "In that car," I said, my voice gaining strength, "Ricardo brought you both home from the hospital. David, your baby seat was fastened with a special belt that your father adapted because you were so small and fragile. Sophia, you threw up strawberry ice cream in the back seat on the way to a picnic, and your father spent the whole afternoon cleaning it, laughing, saying it was your first paint job. In that car, we took you to your first day of school, went to soccer games, to ballet recitals. It was our time capsule, the one place where it was just the four of us, protected from the world." My voice was not pleading. It was factual, the voice of a historian presenting irrefutable evidence of a past they had tried so hard to forget. Sophia looked away, visibly uncomfortable. David clenched his jaw. "That's all very sentimental, Mom, but it doesn't change the facts," he said, his voice hard. "Exactly," Carmen agreed, speaking for the first time. "It's just memories. The car is real, and now it's mine." I turned to her slowly, and for the first time, that night, my gaze was direct and cutting. "Do you really think so?" I asked softly. Then I stood up, went to Ricardo's office, and returned with the leather envelope. I placed it on the coffee table with a soft thud that sounded like a thunderclap in the silent room. "You talk about facts," I said, returning to my seat. "So, let's get to the facts." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The smell of coffee and cookies was replaced by the metallic tension of fear. The leather envelope on the coffee table seemed to pulse with an energy of its own. David, the lawyer, recognized it for what it was, the harbinger of a complication, a variable he had not foreseen in his arrogant calculation. His eyes narrowed, the facade of impatience replaced by a sudden caution. "What is this?" he asked. I didn't answer directly. Instead, I opened the envelope and began to pull out the documents, one by one, placing them on the table like a poker player revealing their cards. First, the photographs of Ricardo with the Ford executives. Then, the engine blueprints, with their complex annotations. Next, the letters on official letterhead. "Your father wasn't just a neighborhood mechanic," I said, my voice low and steady. "He was a genius, a discreet inventor. In the 60s, he collaborated on a secret project with a small team of Ford engineers. They were testing a new type of engine, more powerful, more efficient. An engine that never made it to mass production. Only 3 prototypes were ever built. One exploded during a test. The other was disassembled by the company." I paused, letting the information hang in the air. The 3 of them stared at me, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Then, I picked up the last document, the official appraisal, bound in a clear plastic cover. I slid it across the table until it stopped right in front of them. "And the third one," I said, "has been parked in my garage for 50 years. The silence that followed was absolute. I saw the exact moment their eyes found the number at the bottom of the page. $1,500,000. The reaction was a grotesque spectacle. Sophia's face contorted into a mask of horror and desire. Carmen let out a choked sound as if she had been stabbed. But it was David who had the most telling reaction. The blood drained from his face, and his body went rigid. He wasn't just seeing the lost money. He, the lawyer, was seeing the scale of the professional and legal blunder he had committed. It was then that I finally addressed them with the words I had been rehearsing in my mind. "You didn't sell an old car," I said, each word falling like a stone. "You sold your father's dream for a pittance, driven by greed and disrespect. And Carmen," my gaze fixed on her, "you didn't buy a car. You bought the final proof of your envy, and you paid the price of scrap metal for a treasure." The bomb had been detonated, and the wreckage of their arrogance filled the room. The silence was broken by a sharp whimper from Sophia. "1.5 million?" she whispered, her hand to her chest, as if the number were a physical pain. We sold it for 20,000. Her voice trailed off into a sob of anger and despair. Carmen, for her part, was as pale as wax. "It was a legal sale. I have the papers." "Elena agreed," she stammered, looking to David for support. But David wasn't looking at her. He was staring at me, his lawyer's eyes, frantically scanning the documents on the table, his mind calculating the ramifications. "Where is the title signed by Mom?" he asked, his voice tense. It was my cue for the coup de grace. "That is the most interesting question, isn't it, David?" I replied calmly. "You see, your father was a very careful man. He knew the value of what he had, not just the financial value, but the value as a legacy. Years ago, he placed the Mustang in an irrevocable family trust. I took the final document from the envelope, the trust agreement, and pointed to the relevant clause. For any sale transaction to be legally valid, it would require my express signature and that of an independent administrator of the trust, who happens to be your father's lawyer, Dr. Vance." David's face fell. The color that had fled returned in red blotches of panic and humiliation. He, a respected lawyer, had overseen a fraudulent transaction. He hadn't done his due diligence because, in his mind, I was just his old, ignorant mother, and the car was just an old piece of junk. His arrogance had blinded him to the possibility that there were legal complexities, that I or his father could have been smarter than him. "The sale is void," I declared, my voice resonating with an authority they had never heard from me before. I stood up, the gesture signaling the end of the meeting. "The car will be returned to this garage. Dr. Vance will be in contact with you tomorrow to arrange the details." They stared at me. From the sofa, paralyzed, a trio of statues of greed and regret. I had broken the blind loyalty I felt for them, but more importantly, I had forced them to see themselves for what they were. I walked to the door and opened it. They rose mechanically, like zombies, and walked out in silence. As they stood on the porch, I turned to them, their faces palely lit by the street lamp. "I suggest you enjoy your evening," I said, my voice calm but filled with a cold power, "because tomorrow, your world is going to change. If this story touched your heart, I ask you to join our community of souls who have gone through something similar. If you love Jesus and believe this story will teach us something, subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes of Stories of Healing and Wisdom. Your subscription is an act of faith in your own transformation." The morning after our confrontation did not begin with screams or accusations, but with the majestic, quiet sound of a flatbed truck's engine. I stood on my porch, a cup of steaming coffee in my hands, and watched. Across the street, I saw Carmen's silhouette peering from behind a curtain, a prisoner in her own home. There was no scene, no argument, just two efficient men hired by Dr. Vance's office who secured the Mustang to the flatbed with professional precision. The car, the source of so much pain and greed, looked like a sleeping giant being brought back home. The neighbors, who had witnessed my humiliation days before, now watched this new spectacle in a confused, respectful silence. They didn't understand the details, but they understood the seismic shift in power that was taking place. When the truck maneuvered and parked in front of my garage, and the car was unloaded with reverent care, I felt a knot in my chest undo itself. It was the knot of helplessness, of shame, of forced silence. The driver handed me a clipboard and the keys. My hand did not tremble as I signed the paper. I took the keys, the cold, familiar metal, and thanked them. While this was happening, my phone, which I had left on the living room table, began to vibrate incessantly. First, David, his voice on my voicemail alternating between the fury of a man who had lost control and the pleading of a lawyer who saw his career at risk. Then, Sophia, her theatrical sobs begging me to think of the family, a family she herself had helped to fracture. And finally, Carmen, her messages an incoherent mix of threats and self-pity. I didn't answer any of the calls. I let their voices get lost in the digital ether. My silence was now my most potent weapon, an impenetrable shield that their manipulation could no longer pierce. The victory was not the sound of the Mustang's engine rumbling again in my garage. It was the sound of my phone vibrating in vain, the soundtrack to my newfound peace. The consequences for them were not a storm, but a slow, corrosive drought that dried up the sources of everything they valued most. For David, the fall was professional and quiet. Dr. Vance, in his wisdom, convinced me not to press criminal charges. Let his arrogance be his own gallows, he advised. And it was. The story, though it never hit the papers, spread like a slow poison through the corridors of San Diego's law firms. The brilliant David Ramirez, who boasted of never losing a case, had become the man who, out of greed, oversaw the fraudulent sale of a 7-figure asset belonging to his own mother. He wasn't prosecuted, but he was judged. By his peers. He lost a major client, then another. His partners began to treat him with a cold politeness, excluding him from strategic meetings. The status and power he had used to intimidate me evaporated, leaving behind only an insecure man, consumed by the shame of his monumental mistake. For Sophia, the punishment was social, a death by 1,000 cuts of gossip. In her world, where appearances are everything, her story became a delicious and cruel legend. The perfect hostess, the devoted daughter, was unmasked as a greedy woman who tried to swindle her own mother and, in the process, threw away a fortune. The same friends she had laughed at me with on the phone now whispered about her at spas and charity events. Her party invitations dwindled. The phone calls became rare. She was isolated in her own luxurious mansion, a gilded cage that had now become her prison. The contempt she had for me had turned back on her, and she discovered that high society, just like her, has no pity for the weak or the foolish. And Carmen, oh, Carmen, her punishment was the simplest and the most poetic. She was forced not only to return the car, but to reimburse the transportation costs. The money she had used, the $20,000, was, as I suspected, all she had. She was left with nothing except the contempt of the neighbors and the crushing reality of her own envy. She, who had always wanted what was mine, now had nothing, while I, the woman she despised, was about to control a future she could never imagine. With the Mustang back in the garage, a new dilemma arose. The car sat there, magnificent and silent, but its presence was bittersweet. Looking at it no longer brought me the pure joy of memories of Ricardo. Now it was stained by betrayal, by humiliation. It had become a monument to my family's greed. I spent an entire afternoon sitting on a stool in the garage, just looking at it, letting the emotions come and go. I remembered the gleam in Ricardo's eyes whenever he lifted the hood, the way he spoke of the engine not as a collection of parts, but as a symphony of power and precision. And it was in that moment of silent reflection that the truth revealed itself to me. Ricardo's true legacy was not in that object, however rare and valuable it might be. It was in the genius who created it, in the passion that moved him, in the spirit of innovation and the generosity that always defined him. Keeping that car locked in my garage would be like caging my husband's spirit. It would be an act of selfishness, an attachment to the past that would prevent me from building a future. That Mustang had been a source of joy, then a weapon of humiliation, and now, I saw, it could be a tool for transformation. To truly honor Ricardo and to completely free myself from the chains of that trauma, I needed to let the car go. But this time, it would be on my terms. The decision formed in my mind, clear and unwavering. I would not sell it to buy luxuries for myself. I would transform the symbol of their greed into an engine of hope for others. I would auction Ricardo's masterpiece and use its value to sow the dreams of a new generation of geniuses like him. The auction was an event Ricardo would have both loved and despised. It took place at a prestigious auction house in Monterey, a place where the air smelled of old money and expensive leather. The room was filled with wealthy men in well-tailored suits and elegant women with jewels that sparkled. Under the bright lights, they saw the Mustang as an asset, a collector's item, a way to diversify their portfolios. They discussed horsepower, chassis numbers, and appreciation potential. Sitting discreetly at the back of the room with Dr. Vance by my side, I saw something entirely different. I saw the nights Ricardo came home with his hands covered in grease and a tired but satisfied smile. I saw the sacrifices we made, the love and hope that were poured into every bolt and every piece of that engine. When the Mustang was revealed on the revolving stage, a hush of admiration fell over the room. It was undeniably a work of art. The light danced on its cherry-red paint, and it seemed alive, pulsating with a history that no one there, except me, truly knew. The auctioneer began, and the numbers climbed rapidly, a dizzying ascent from hundreds of thousands to millions. Each bid was a validation of my husband's genius. I didn't feel a shred of sadness or loss. Instead, I felt a deep peace, a sense of poetic justice. The value my children had dismissed for $20,000 was being recognized by the world. When the hammer finally fell, at a number that exceeded even the most optimistic appraisal, a round of applause filled the room. I did not cry. I just smiled, a silent smile for Ricardo. The money was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. With the proceeds from the auction, the Ricardo Ramirez Foundation was born. Guided by Dr. Vance and a small board I helped assemble, the foundation's mission was clear and direct: to fully fund the university education of talented, low-income young people who wished to pursue careers in mechanical engineering. We transformed Ricardo's legacy of metal into a legacy of opportunity. My life changed completely. I sold the big house, with its painful memories and empty rooms, and moved into a bright, airy apartment overlooking the ocean in Coronado. I traded gardening for philanthropy. My mornings were no longer filled with the silence of loneliness, but with meetings, reading essays from students full of dreams, and phone calls with university deans. I, who had been treated as an invisible burden, became the driving force behind an organization that was actively changing lives. As for David, Sophia, and Carmen, the final step of my liberation was one last act of detachment. I sent each of them a letter, registered and formal. The letter contained no recriminations or anger. It simply informed them, succinctly, of the creation of the Ricardo Ramirez Foundation in honor of their father, and stated my wish to have no further contact. I attached a copy of the foundation's brochure, not to taunt them, but so they would understand what they had lost. It wasn't the money. It was the chance to participate in something meaningful, to honor the man whose legacy they tried to profit from. I didn't need their forgiveness, nor their empty apologies. I needed my peace, and by sealing those envelopes, I reclaimed it. My children live in huge houses, full of expensive things and a deafening silence that, I imagine, must be filled with the echo of their regret. They pursued the value of things and, in the process, lost the value of everything. I, on the other hand, live in this small place, with the sea breeze as my companion, and the sound of my own choices filling my days. My living room window frames the vastness of the ocean, a constant reminder that the world is much larger than the small prisons we build for ourselves. Sometimes, I receive letters from scholarship students. They tell me about their projects, their hopes, about how the opportunity they received changed the course of their lives. They speak of Ricardo with a reverence my own children never had. In those letters, my husband is more alive than ever. The pain of betrayal, which was once an open wound, is now a pale scar, a reminder not of the pain, but of the strength I discovered in myself. Today, I do not have the luxury they so desperately chase. I do not have a garage with a hidden treasure, but I wake up every morning with a purpose. I have the respect of young people I have never met, and most importantly, I have regained respect for myself, and that no one can ever take from me again. 2 years passed. Time, which once dragged on in a gray monotony of loneliness, now flew by, filled with a purpose that rejuvenated my soul. That evening, I was in the ballroom of a hotel overlooking the San Diego Bay, at the second annual gala for the Ricardo Ramirez Foundation. The atmosphere was the polar opposite of my daughter's tense, pretentious parties. Here, the air vibrated not with the ostentation of wealth, but with the contagious energy of gratitude and hope. The sound of genuine laughter mingled with lively discussions about thermodynamics and chassis design. The guests were not tycoons and socialites, but brilliant students with dreamy eyes, passionate university professors, and small business owners from the automotive industry who believed in our mission. I felt like a different person myself. I had swapped my faded cardigans for an elegant but simple navy blue dress. My posture, once stooped by the weight of disappointment, was now erect. I moved through the ballroom not as a nervous hostess, but as the proud matriarch of a huge, boisterous family that I myself had chosen. People greeted me with a respect and affection that were balms to old scars. I was no longer poor Elena, the sentimental old lady. I was Mrs. Ramirez, the woman who had turned an old car into dozens of promising futures. The change was not just external, it was a fundamental internal reconstruction. The woman who had been silenced and humiliated in her own home now used her voice to introduce speakers, to encourage a shy student, to share a story about Ricardo that inspired a new generation to dream. The highlight of the evening was the speech by Marco Diaz, one of our foundation's first scholarship recipients. He took the stage, a tall, thin young man with calloused hands from a life of hard work and eyes that shone with a fierce intelligence. A silence fell over the hall as he began to speak, his voice steady but charged with emotion. He spoke of his childhood in Barrio Logan, of fixing neighbors' cars for a few dollars since he was 12, dreaming of the engines he saw in magazines. He spoke of being the top student in his high school class, only to see the university doors closing on him due to the crushing reality of a lack of money. I believed my future was that dusty workshop in my backyard, he said, his voice cracking for a moment. I thought dreams like mine weren't for kids like me. Then, he spoke about the letter he received from the Ricardo Ramirez Foundation. It wasn't just a check, he continued, looking directly at me in the front row. It was permission to dream. It was the voice of a man I never met, and of a woman who became my second mother, telling me that my potential mattered. He told us about his first year at Caltech, about the thrill of being in a real laboratory, about the project he was working on to develop a more efficient hybrid engine. At the end of his speech, he turned to me and said, "Mrs. Ramirez, you didn't just honor your husband's memory. You built a bridge so that kids like me could cross the chasm between who we are and who we can be. And for that, I will be eternally grateful." The tears that rolled down my face that night were not of pain, but of a pure, overwhelming joy. It was living proof that my decision had been the right one. Ricardo's legacy wasn't rusting in a garage. It was alive, pulsating, building the future. Later, seeking a moment of tranquility, I went out to a balcony overlooking the sparkling city lights. The cool night air was a welcome relief. It was then that I felt my cell phone vibrate in my purse. a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated, as old reflexes of anxiety still lingered. I opened the text message. The words were simple, but they made my heart skip a beat. "Grandma? It's Lucas, your grandson. Sorry to bother you. I know it's late. Lucas, Sophia's son." I hadn't seen him since before the great confrontation. In my memory, he was still a quiet, observant 15-year-old boy. I felt a wave of conflicting emotions. The instinctive love of a grandmother, the wariness of a betrayed woman. Could this be a ploy by Sophia, using her own son to attempt a reconciliation? My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to delete the message, to protect the peace I had fought so hard to win. But another part, a tender curiosity, stopped me. What did this boy, now a young man, want from me? I replied with carefully worded caution. "Lucas, I am at an event. Has something happened?" The response was almost immediate. "No, nothing bad. It's just, I'm nearby, at the cafe across the street. I saw about the Foundation's event online. I just wanted to know if I could talk to you for 5 minutes. Please." The please broke through my defenses. It was not Sophia's demanding tone nor David's arrogance. It was the humble request of a boy. I agreed. I found him at a table in the corner of the nearly empty cafe. He had grown into a tall young man, with his mother's eyes but a serious, introspective expression that was all his own. He stood up awkwardly as I approached, his hands in his pockets, nervousness written all over his face. There was no sign of manipulation there, only the sincere angst of adolescence. "Thanks for coming, Grandma," he said, his voice a bit unsteady. "I know that. Things are complicated." He told me he was in his senior year of high school, preparing his college applications, and that, against the wishes of his parents who wanted him to study finance, he intended to major in mechanical engineering. He told me that after everything happened, he started researching his grandfather Ricardo, reading old articles, looking for any information he could find. He had become fascinated. "What they did was wrong," he said, looking down at his hands on the table. "They don't talk about it, but the house is filled with a heavy silence. They're always angry, always sad, and everything revolves around money. The money they lost." He raised his eyes to me, and what I saw there was a devastating clarity. "I don't want to be like them, Grandma. I want to build things, not break them." In that moment, he was not Sophia's son, the personification of my pain. He was just Lucas, a young man trying to find his own path, seeking a connection to the only part of his heritage that wasn't stained by greed. I didn't offer him easy words of comfort, nor did I use the opportunity to criticize his parents. The new Elena didn't need that. Instead, I offered him the only thing of value I had left to give: the truth, seasoned with wisdom. "Your parents made their choices, Lucas," I said softly, "and they will have to live with them. The most important lesson you can learn from this is not to judge them, but to ensure that your own choices are different, that they come from a place of passion and integrity, not from fear or greed." I told him a story about Ricardo, about how he could hear the problem in an engine just by its sound, a talent he called soul mechanics. I saw my grandson's face light up, the genuine fascination in his eyes. I offered to read his college application essays, to help him prepare his portfolio. The connection that formed between us at that cafe table was not a return to the past, but the beginning of something new. It was a bridge, built not on the ruins of family obligation, but on the solid pillars of mutual respect and a shared legacy of love for engineering. When we said goodbye, he gave me a quick, slightly awkward hug. "Thank you, Grandma," he whispered. "Really." Watching him walk away, I knew the cycle of pain had been broken. I returned to the ballroom just in time to see the last guests leaving. The energy of the evening still hung in the air. Dr. Vance, my old friend and rock, came to me with a tired smile. "Ricardo would be bursting with pride tonight, Elena," he said, squeezing my shoulder. A group of students approached, drawing me into a lively conversation about a new fuel cell design. In that circle of bright, idealistic young people, I felt a sense of belonging I hadn't experienced in decades. I was not a lonely grandmother in an empty house. I was the center of a vibrant community, a family forged not by blood, but by a common purpose. They were my children and grandchildren in spirit, and the love and respect they gave me were unconditional, earned not by birthright, but by actions. The loneliness that had once been my constant companion had been banished, replaced by a rich tapestry of genuine human connections. I finally understood that family is not something one passively inherits, but something one actively builds every day with acts of trust, support, and love. And my new family was vast, loud, brilliant, and beautiful. When the night finally ended, I walked to the parking garage. The cold air wrapped around me, clearing the last traces of the evening's excitement. I reached my car, not a flashy classic, but a modern, silver, and understated sedan. Reliable, safe. A car for a woman who knows where she is going. It didn't carry the weight of history like the Mustang. Instead, it represented the serene promise of the future. I opened the door and sat in the driver's seat, the new car smell still faintly lingering in the air. It was the smell of a new beginning. It was the opposite of the smell of oil and memories from my old garage. It was the scent of my new life, a life that was not defined by a man, no matter how wonderful he was, nor by children, no matter how beloved they had once been. This was a life that belonged completely to me, a life built from my own resilience, my own courage to rewrite the narrative. I was no longer a supporting character in anyone else's story. I was the protagonist of my own. Before starting the engine, my fingers found the keychain. There, next to the black plastic remote for my new car, hung a single, worn, silver metal key, the original key to the 1966 Ford Mustang. I ran my thumb over the grooves in the cold metal. For so long, that key had represented a piercing pain, the materialization of a profound loss and betrayal. But that night, holding it, I felt something different. It was no longer a ghost. It was a relic. It was the metal seed from which my entire new life had sprouted. It represented Ricardo's genius, yes, but it also represented my own strength to transform a weapon of humiliation into a tool of creation. It was proof that the most painful things in life can sometimes become the catalysts for our greatest transformation. It was a reminder that the true value of something lies not in its market price or its rarity, but in the story it allows us to tell and the future it allows us to build. I kept it not as an attachment to the past, but as a tribute to the journey. I started the engine, the soft, quiet sound of the modern car filling the space. I drove out of the parking garage and took the highway along the coast. To my left, the infinite darkness of the Pacific Ocean. To my right, the lights of the city where I had lived, loved, suffered, and finally, been reborn. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. For years, the woman who stared back at me was a stranger, a pale figure with sad eyes, whose edges seemed to dissolve into the landscape. A woman who had become invisible to others because she had first become invisible to herself. But the woman in the mirror that night was different. There was silver in her hair, yes, and the lines on her face told the story of her 7 decades. But her eyes were no longer empty. They shone with the city lights, with purpose, with a hard-won peace. There was a strength in her jaw and a faint smile on her lips, a smile that came from within. It took me a long time to recognize myself in the mirror. But today, finally, I see the woman I have become.